You recently wrote in The Economist that business leaders and all Americans who care about respect for the law, stability, and prosperity should, quote, do everything they can to prevent Trump's return to the White House. Why?
Well, the short answer is that the rule of law is what has made America very special. It has made an environment for business that has been spectacular, a glowing beacon to the entire world. It is what's made, kind of our kind of notion of human rights and good governance and a bunch of other things. And Trump not only himself, like he's a convicted felon now, but it's also articulated in many different contexts a complete disregard for the law. Like, for example, it's like, well, all right, his legal defense has argued that he should be able to order, kind of the instruments of state to kill his political opponents, and he should be immune from that legally. He's, on campaign said I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, it'd be fine. And it's like, and whenever violence does happen, Charlottesville, January 6th insurrection, he never disavows it. He never says that I'm completely opposed. This is an antithesis of what I stand for and the America that I want to see. And so having a rule of law, which includes peaceful democracy and the progression, is fundamental to all American interest and including business interest. And that was the thing that I really wanted to make sure was well understood. And so I, wrote the piece in The Economist.
And so, what would Trump returning to the White House, what would that mean and do to the rule of law?
Well, what I argue in the piece is you take him literally and seriously. So when he says something like, I'm going to, fire tens of thousands of people in the military and replace them, with essentially loyalists, you should say, well, take that seriously, right? Like if someone were announcing that they were intending to, as opposed to the U.S. Military, again, an amazing part of our American institutions, swears allegiance to the Constitution, not to the president, not to anyone else, to essentially our rule of law, our way of life. Someone says, I'm going to go, overturn that. You should say, well, okay, you're making a deeply anti-American statement. Maybe he will do that. Maybe he will persecute his political opponents with the instruments of state. Maybe he will, like there's all of these things that become unknown. And I literally talk to business leaders who are fearful about speaking out against this because they're fearful of retaliation. That should not be something that occurs within the United States. That's something that where we pride ourselves as a strong country against, other ones. It's because of this rule of law. It's because of this notion of a democracy that we participate in peacefully with peaceful transitions of power.
So you're saying that you've spoken to business leaders who are concerned about Trump, but they don't want to say that publicly because why?
Because what they're fearful of is specifically retaliation. The retaliation can range anything from, like ordering, IRS audits or anything else, to potentially using the mechanics of state. This is how democracies break, when they start using the mechanics of state to put people in jail, when without due process, without the things that are kind of guaranteed by our founding fathers in the Constitution. And that's what, I don't want to see, pictures of the Bible held upside down saying, oh, I care about this. I want to say I care about the rule of law, and I care about the fact that, for example, in Trump's case, unanimous verdicts of 12 Americans have found him guilty of, fraud, of defamation around sexual assault, around, misinformation in campaigning. These things are things that we should treat seriously, because the rule of law is the foundation of which all of the other special things of this country get built upon.
So you said that some business leaders are concerned that if they speak out, that Trump could use the instruments of government against them if he were to win the White House. Are you concerned that Trump could retaliate against you?
Well, clearly, by participating in interviews like this, it's very possible. Um, and but I kind of think that when you feel fear, is the precise time that when you should think about stepping up. Right? It's part of how we say, like, I'm a believer in America. I'm a believer in rule of law. I'm a believer in peaceful democracy. And if retaliation happens because of this, then in a sense, that validates why I should step up. But of course, I'm concerned. And I get a lot of advice from people around me not to do things like this because you don't know, you should keep your head down. I mean, there's just literally a conversation I had this morning. You should keep your head down because, you should just, let things play out. You shouldn't take personal risk on this. And it's like, well, precisely when you feel that is precisely when you should say, I should speak up.
Why do you think we've heard a change of tune from some business leaders who had been critical of former President Trump, but are now enthusiastically supporting him?
Well, I think it's a whole range. And the question is what they'll say and what they really think. I do think that when you look at kind of like everything from the fear, what we we're just talking about, which is, okay, President Biden isn't going to retaliate because he is, strong on the rule of law and has never demonstrated ever using any political arms for his own, kind of political position. So they're fearful about retaliation. So you declare loyalty early. This is, what happens in this is what happened in Nazi Germany, what happens in other places. So there's a negative. Then there's the so-called positive, which is, well, Trump is much more coin operated than Biden. So maybe you can buy influence. So if you're going to plunk down some money to buy influence, you can buy influence with Trump, whereas you can't buy influence with Biden. And then probably the most positive, which I think is just a bad misunderstanding, is that Biden's administration, like Lena Khan, I think has a set of serious problems. She's like doing like, I just will bring the lawsuits against the businesses no matter what, even if I'm going to lose them. It's like, no, that's a waste of, you're decreasing economic resources in the country. You shouldn't do that. You should be following the institution. And so, I think they go, well, that's anti-business. And so Trump is more pro-business. But what they don't realize is that pro-rule of law is the most fundamental pro-business. So I think it's a whole range by which different business leaders are making their own calculus and sometimes coming out pro-Trump. And part of the reason why I thought it was important to write this piece, do this discussion with you, is to say, no, Biden is actually more pro-business.
Biden is more pro-business. So Biden has advocated higher taxes, higher corporate taxes, higher taxes on millionaires, on billionaires. Former President Trump wants lower taxes. And he's also talked a lot about lighter regulation relative to the current president, Biden. So you're saying, though, that you actually think that Biden is more pro-business than Trump?
So if the only things about being pro-business were regulation and taxes, then you go, okay, great. It's whoever goes lower regulation, lower taxes. But because it's a healthy operating society with a rule of law, like the investing in the future is part of what allows businesses to function well. It's the trust that other countries have in us and our system and how we interact, which allows our industries to export and allows the dollar to be the reserve world currency of the world. That rule of law and that kind of baseline stability is more important for business than whether or not your tax rate goes up or whether or not there's a new regulation. And that's the reason why Biden is fundamentally, no matter what, more pro-business than Trump. Now, that being said, I obviously, try to advocate for, intelligent reformation of regulation and having tax system be the right kind of thing that allows us to invest in the future. Because, I myself have made my life career in business. but the rule of law and the stability of the society is the most fundamental, which makes everything else work.
So the rule of law is most fundamental. Can you just sort of play it out for me, though? Say you're a business owner and you like the idea of lower taxes and lighter regulation. You're not thinking front and center about rule of law. Can you just explain sort of tangibly, though, why does that matter to the business owner?
Well, if the rule of, it's not just kind of the questions around like, what is kind of, civil order on the streets and that kind of thing. But like, part of the prosperity of the system we live in is because people will invest capital, across borders and other areas. And so they'll invest in supply chains, and they'll ship orders on credit, and they'll do all these things because they're anticipating a well-functioning society. And if that breaks for us and you say, okay, where all of a sudden people are like, I'm not sure, will the US be better functioning a year from now than it is now, then all kinds of capital flows begin to respond, not just, domestic, which obviously are important, is like, well, as opposed to investing in something in the future, I'm going to hold on to the capital because I don't know what's going on, but also internationally. People may ship fewer things to us for products in the streets, and they may say, no, you have to pay us up front because we don't know, we're not trusting that we're going to get paid. That's the kind of thing that breaks. Plus, by the way, you get questions around, kind of the notion of like when you say, like in 1900, Argentina and the US had roughly the same GDP. It's a case in point of when you have a strong, vigorous society, because by the way, they also have a whole bunch of resources and so forth, like that, what it creates in economic prosperity. We don't want to roll back to the comparison to where Argentina is today with a much weaker rule of society and kind of rule of law, dictators and other kinds of things, which cause the entire business sector to be much less productive.
You said we have to take former President Trump literally. Do you think that the business leaders who are supporting him, are they being naive?
I think broadly, since I think a lot of them, the ones who've come out are actually, smart people. I think they're saying, oh, he's just saying that for politics. That's just the catering to the populist masses, and it'll be different. And by the way, that was the same thing Hindenburg said about Hitler. Right? It's one of the reasons why I said, no. When someone says something pretty outrageous, like, like we're going to have violent rebellion or that kind of stuff, you should take them literally and seriously. You shouldn't say, no, that's just the rallying. That's just the cry at the rally. That is super dangerous. And in history, that always plays out very badly.
So that's the second time you've mentioned Hitler. Do you see parallels between what's going on now and what was happening in Germany before the rise of Hitler?
I see parallels in multiple places where democracy, because there was the Weimar Republic of democracy being challenged. And it's one of the places where obviously when the democracy fell, it fell very badly for German citizens and for the world. It's one modern one, but I think there's a number of cases where democracy has failed. And it's because people don't speak up for the rule of law. Leaders don't say that's the baseline. After, rule of law first, and until that's solid, we don't talk about anything else. We don't talk about corporate tax rates. We don't talk about regulation, because rule of law is what's most important.
How would you evaluate President Biden on the economy? What letter grade would you give him on the economy? And how about former President Trump?
So, I would give Biden, it's probably, an A minus. It could be B plus A minus. There's certain things that I think Lena Khan is doing a lot to kind of impede the American economy. So I think, that's bad. But I think that there's a bunch of other things like, the kind of the IRA Act, kind of a lot of good bipartisan legislation, which is enabling things, which I think is very good. I think he, so often politicking is called socialist. He's actually very centrist. And so is kind of actually trying to bring everything together to make stuff work for the average American. I mean, like, for example, he, despite the fact the environmental lobby doesn't like this, he's raised gas production to the greatest point in history to try to lower gas prices, which is one of the things that, helps everyday Americans and helps the economy. So, I think that this is so I think he's doing a solid, very good job, which is where the letter grade. And look, I think Trump in his earlier thing, where he started with a fairly strong cabinet, and was trying to do a bunch of stuff like, hey, you want a new regulation, remove an old regulation, did a bunch of stuff that was not bad for the economy then. I think the problem is it's something like, someone told me, and I have to go validate this, but it's something like 40 of the 44 senior people who worked for Trump now are like, he's a disaster, I'd never work for him again. And you're like, well, if you understand business at all, if your entire exec staff says this CEO really blows, you really take a close look at that CEO. And the fact is, everyone who's done business knows that, part of hiring a quality executive is, do they have quality people who have worked for them, who would work for them again? And, Trump is a F on that.
You said that President Biden is maybe an A- on the economy. The American people would not give him an A-, even though we have historically low unemployment, high GDP, and a lot of progress on inflation. He still gets very low numbers on the economy. Consumer confidence is relatively low. Why do you think there is that disconnect?
Well, I think some of it is, I don't think he markets himself very well because he's doing the job versus going out and saying, look at how great a job I've done. It's like, would you rather have someone doing the job, or would you rather have someone tweeting? Right. And, Biden tends to work on doing the job. But I think you need to spend some time doing the job. And I think, socializing what you're doing. I also think that we obviously have a massive cultural, kind of conflict, a conflagration going on here. And so a lot of people are yelling, you're worse off, and it's bad. And by the way, some of the sub elements of that is like, well, look, the job numbers are great, but I worry about prices. I worry about prices of gasoline and housing, and I think Biden is trying to work on that. Like, he has brought the gas prices down some with production, but it's still, more challenging for your average American because they care about like groceries, rent, gas. I got to put those things together. And, I think we as American leaders need to be helping with that, because I think that's still a place where many Americans are feeling some pain. But, one of the questions to ask yourself is, who cares more about you, Biden or Trump? I think everybody, even the people who support Trump, go, oh yeah, Biden cares more. And, trying to bring those three together to the average American, I think that really matters.
One other question on the politics here. Are you concerned that either Biden or Trump, or both of them, are just too old to be president?
Well, I think it's a common thing that all Americans would prefer that all of the candidates who are running were in their 50s or 60s or maybe even 70s, because, who would you rather have, your kind of wise, kind Grandpa Joe, or your demented, kind of haywire Grandpa Donald, right? And it's like, well, we'd rather have somebody who's not, who's a little younger, I think is a very common sentiment. But, that's kind of, if the wishes were fishes kind of thing. And you have to decide between, a certain amount of kind of wisdom and centrism, or a certain kind of, Twitter populism. For me, the choice is clear.
Now, the Trump campaign responded in a statement that attacked Reid Hoffman, describing him as, quote, a protege of George Soros, attacking his personal character. However, the Trump campaign did not directly address any of Reid Hoffman's actual arguments here. And listen, at the end of the day, this is going to be a matter for the American voters to decide about who's going to be best for the economy, who's going to be best for everyone's own personal financial situation. Clearly, Jim, that is going to be a major deciding factor in November.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion on this about whether a huge immigration crackdown, how that would affect a big business in this country because relying on migrant labor, and also what happens if Trump imposes tariffs, you know, in a huge way. That obviously will have a ripple effect. And Trump apparently posted on Truth Social about firing CEOs. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. Trump, about 2 days ago, he posted on his social media platform that business executives and shareholder representatives should be 100% behind Donald Trump. Anybody that's not should be fired for incompetence. And that post on Truth Social went on to quote a Wall Street Journal story talking about how Donald Trump is pushing for lower corporate tax rates. And President Biden wants to raise the corporate tax rate. Just a stunning statement there from the former president. But to get back to your point about what happens on immigration and trade, it is really important to remember that inflation, right, the cost of living, remains the #1 frustration for Americans right now when it comes to the economy. And what's interesting is that economists that I've spoken to have argued that some of Trump's campaign proposals would actually run the risk of making inflation worse. Specifically, the idea of increasing tariffs on China, having across-the-board tariffs, that ultimately that would raise costs for businesses and for consumers. And also on the immigration front, I mean, former President Trump has advocated for sweeping deportations at a time when a lot of businesses say they need more workers, not less. And economists warn that if you deport a lot of people, then you could have a situation where wages go higher and that would lift prices. So a lot of factors at play when you think about what some of these policies would actually do to the economy.